In the late 1930s, America was still a nation licking its wounds from the Great Depression. Millions had lost their jobs. Businesses had closed their doors. For a decade, families learned to survive on less money, less security, and often less hope. The factory towns that once buzzed with life were quiet, their smokestacks cold, their machines covered in dust. But across the ocean, something far more dangerous was stirring, a storm that would pull those silent factories back to life and change the course of history forever. When war erupted in Europe in 1939, the United States tried to stay out of it. The pain of World War I was still fresh, and many Americans wanted nothing to do with another foreign conflict. America first was the popular cry. But as Hitler's armies rolled across Europe and Japan's empire spread across Asia, isolation became harder to defend. Bit by bit, the US began to prepare, not yet for war, but for the possibility that it might not have a choice. Factories that had been idle began receiving government contracts. Automobile plants were asked to design trucks, spare parts, even prototype weapons. It was a small start, but it planted the seed of what would become one of the greatest industrial transformations in human history. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood something that few others did at the time. He knew wars weren't just won on the battlefield, they were won in the factories. He famously said that America must become the arsenal of democracy, supplying not only its own military, but also the forces of freedom around the world. That idea would become a rallying cry, a national mission that turned an economy of despair into one of unstoppable power. At first, people doubted it could be done. How could a country that couldn't even keep its own citizens employed possibly produce enough to fight global tyranny? But the American story has always thrived on impossible odds. And as the 1940s dawned, something began to shift. Industrial leaders, men like Henry Ford, William Knudsen of General Motors, and shipbuilder Henry Kaiser, stepped forward. These were not generals or politicians. They were builders, innovators, engineers. They had spent decades mastering the art of mass production, and now they were asked to apply that genius to war. The government brought them in, often reluctantly at first, but soon realized their value. Knudsen famously said, "Gentlemen, wars are not won by soldiers alone. They are won by production." America's economy began to pivot. Assembly lines that once turned out shiny cars started rolling out military trucks, aircraft engines, and tanks. Typewriter companies made machine guns. Refrigerator companies made aircraft parts. Every tool, every hand, every hour began to count toward one goal: readiness. Then came the shock that turned preparation into full-scale mobilization: Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the US Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. Within 24 hours, the nation that had been cautious and divided was suddenly united by fury and resolve. War had come, and there was no turning back. Factories switched from 3 shifts to 5, running 24 hours a day. Men enlisted by the millions, and those who stayed behind grabbed welding torches, hammers, and blueprints. America wasn't just entering the war, it was transforming into a machine built to win it. The scale of this change is almost hard to imagine today. Within a single year, the United States built more planes, more ships, and more vehicles than all the Axis powers combined. Entire cities seemed to hum with purpose. Detroit, once the capital of the automobile, became known as the arsenal of democracy. The auto industry led the charge. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan became a legend of engineering, capable of building a complete B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. Imagine that, a 4-engine heavy bomber with thousands of parts and miles of wiring, completed 60 times a day. To do it, Ford had to invent new techniques for mass-producing aircraft. It wasn't easy. Early on, planes rolled out half-finished or defective. But American ingenuity thrived on mistakes, and soon, Willow Run was delivering bombers faster than anyone thought possible. General Motors wasn't far behind. They produced tanks, engines, and parts for thousands of military vehicles. Chrysler built the massive M4 Sherman tanks that would become the backbone of Allied armor in Europe. Every company joined the fight, no matter how unlikely. Singer, the sewing machine company, built guns. Underwood, the typewriter maker, crafted rifle parts. Even the makers of toys, bicycles, and cash registers found themselves producing components for warplanes and munitions. But this transformation wasn't just about machines. It was about people. Millions of American men went off to fight, leaving a hole in the nation's workforce. Into that gap stepped women, by the millions. Housewives, secretaries, teachers, and farm workers traded their aprons for overalls and learned to weld, rivet, and assemble. For many, it was the first time they had ever worked in a factory. They were nervous at first, unsure they could handle heavy machinery or precision tools. But soon, they proved everyone wrong. They became icons of a new era. Rosie the Riveter, strong, capable, and patriotic. The image of Rosie, flexing her arm beneath the words, "We can do it," wasn't just propaganda. It captured a truth. America's industrial miracle depended as much on women as it did on men. By 1943, women made up more than 1/3 of the nation's workforce. They built planes in California, ships in Virginia, and tanks in Detroit. They handled dangerous chemicals, climbed scaffolds, and learned to read blueprints. Their pay was lower than men's, but their contribution was priceless. The government launched massive campaigns to support the effort. War bonds were sold in every town. Citizens collected scrap metal and rubber, knowing it might end up as part of a tank or a fighter plane. Even children joined in, gathering tin cans and old tires for recycling drives. Production wasn't just about quantity, it was about speed. America's ability to innovate and adapt became its secret weapon. Henry Kaiser's shipyards revolutionized shipbuilding. Before the war, building a cargo ship took months. Kaiser figured out how to do it in weeks, and sometimes in days. His teams built Liberty ships, sturdy, simple vessels that carried supplies across the Atlantic faster than German U-boats could sink them. These ships weren't glamorous, but they were essential. They carried food, fuel, ammunition, and soldiers to every corner of the globe. Without them, Allied armies could not have moved or fought. Kaiser's record-breaking pace became a symbol of what American industry could achieve when unleashed. Meanwhile, in the skies, America's aircraft production became the envy of the world. Companies like Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed turned out bombers and fighters by the thousands. The P-51 Mustang, one of the most famous planes of the war, was born in record time, designed, tested, and produced in less than a year. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-29 Superfortress became legends of strategic bombing, raining destruction on Axis strongholds from thousands of feet above. None of this came easy. There were shortages of materials, transportation bottlenecks, and constant design changes. Engineers had to invent new alloys, new fuels, and new manufacturing techniques almost overnight. The government had to coordinate thousands of companies, big and small, and somehow keep everyone supplied and motivated. Mistakes cost lives, but delays cost battles, and failure was not an option. Yet somehow, through all the chaos, it worked. By 1944, the United States was producing nearly half of all war goods made in the world. In that single year, American factories built almost 100,000 aircraft more than Germany managed in the entire war. The nation's GDP doubled between 1939 and 1945. What had once been an economy of scarcity became an engine of abundance, and behind it all was a sense of unity rarely seen before or since. People from every walk of life joined the effort: factory workers, scientists, farmers, engineers and students. Immigrants who had come seeking opportunity found it on the production line. African Americans, long excluded from many industries, found new jobs through the Fair Employment Practices Committee. Though inequality and segregation persisted, the war opened cracks in barriers that would later fuel the civil rights movement. America was changing, not just economically, but socially. When the war began, many feared democracy itself was too slow, too divided to stand up to totalitarian powers. But the industrial miracle of the 1940s proved them wrong. The United States didn't rely on slave labor or conquest. It relied on freedom, creativity, and the belief that ordinary people could do extraordinary things. Factories weren't just producing weapons, they were producing confidence. Each tank rolling off an assembly line, each ship sliding into the water, each plane taking flight was a message to the world: freedom can fight back. By the end of 1942, the arsenal of democracy was fully awake. The quiet factories of the Depression were gone. In their place stood a nation working without rest, fueled by purpose, driven by innovation, and united by a belief that the future could be won not just by armies, but by the hands of workers building something greater than themselves. America had done what seemed impossible. It had turned its weakness into strength, its despair into determination. The Industrial Revolution of World War II was not just about machines and numbers, it was about spirit. The same people who once stood in bread lines were now building bombers. The same factories that had gone dark were now lighting the path to victory. The arsenal of democracy was not born in a single day. It was forged in crisis, powered by belief, and guided by a simple idea that freedom, when organized and determined, could outbuild and outlast tyranny. And as 1943 approached, that idea would be tested on every front, from the deserts of North Africa to the skies over Europe and across the vast Pacific Ocean. Because the factories of America were no longer just making weapons, they were building the means to change the world forever. By 1943, the American war machine had reached full throttle. From the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, factories pulsed day and night, pounding out the material that would decide the fate of the world. The air itself seemed to vibrate with energy, a low industrial hum that echoed from steel mills, shipyards, aircraft plants, and munitions depots. The change was astonishing. In just 2 years, the United States had gone from economic depression to industrial domination. The statistics were staggering, almost unbelievable. Every 5 minutes, a new tank rolled off an assembly line. Every 2 minutes, an artillery piece was completed. Every 60 seconds, an aircraft took flight. But behind those numbers were people, ordinary men and women who had learned extraordinary skills. Across the country, families worked together toward one purpose: victory. Fathers fought overseas, mothers and daughters built what they needed to survive, and sons trained for the next campaign. It wasn't just a war effort. It was a national effort. Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Seattle, each became a fortress of production. The heartbeat of the nation was measured not by the stock market or the price of gold, but by the rumble of freight trains carrying supplies to the front. Coal, steel, rubber, and oil, the raw veins of industrial power, coursed through the land like blood through a living organism. America had become, quite literally, a factory with borders. Factories that once competed now cooperated. Rival companies shared patents, engineers, and even workers. Ford and General Motors stopped advertising their own products. Instead, they boasted of bombers and tanks. Corporate pride was replaced by national purpose. The federal government played the conductor to this industrial orchestra. The War Production Board, created in 1942, coordinated resources, labor, and contracts. Its job was simple but overwhelming. Make sure every bolt, every drop of oil, every ounce of copper went where it was needed most. Rationing became a fact of life. Citizens gave up sugar, gasoline, and rubber so that soldiers could have what they required at the front, and still the production never stopped. In California, aircraft factories became cities unto themselves. Boeing's plant in Seattle built the legendary B-17 Flying Fortress, while Lockheed in Burbank produced the sleek P-38 Lightning, and North American Aviation in Inglewood turned out the P-51 Mustang, the long-range fighter that would eventually dominate the skies over Europe. Each factory employed tens of thousands of people. The scale was immense. The B-24 bomber alone had over 450,000 individual parts. Yet somehow, through new methods of assembly and precise coordination, it rolled off production lines faster than almost any other aircraft in history. Out on the coasts, Kaiser's shipyards were still smashing records. His workers, many of them new to heavy industry, built Liberty ships faster than anyone thought humanly possible. One famous example was the Robert E. Peary, launched just 4 days and 15 hours after her keel was laid. The world watched in disbelief, and Germany's U-boat commanders took notice. Those ships carried everything: fuel, ammunition, tanks, food, and men. They were the arteries that kept the Allied armies alive. Without them, the invasion of North Africa, the fight in Italy, and the future invasion of France would have been impossible. The secret to this success wasn't just manpower, it was organization. America mastered logistics, the art of moving things, not just making them. New highways, rail lines, and ports were expanded. The government created systems to track supplies from factory floor to frontline foxhole. Every crate, every shell, every can of beans was accounted for. Generals began to say that wars were won by logistics, and in that field, America reigned supreme. But industrial power wasn't limited to weapons. Science, too, had joined the fight. Research labs across the country buzzed with innovation. Radar became a key advantage, allowing Allied planes and ships to detect enemies before they struck. Chemists developed synthetic rubber when supplies from Asia were cut off. Engineers improved engines, armor, and communication systems. Each invention, each improvement, gave the Allies another edge. Even medicine advanced. The mass production of penicillin, first discovered before the war but never widely available, saved countless lives on the battlefield. What had once been a laboratory curiosity became a miracle drug thanks to American industry. And then there was the secret no one could talk about: the Manhattan Project. While factories turned out planes and tanks, a select group of scientists and engineers worked under the tightest secrecy imaginable. From New Mexico to Tennessee, they labored on a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen: the atomic bomb. It was science pushed to its absolute limit, born from the same belief that had powered the rest of America's industrial miracle: that the impossible was only temporary. Yet for all its triumphs, this transformation came at a cost. The home front was not without sacrifice. Families lived with rationing, with shortages, with uncertainty. Workers endured long hours in dangerous conditions. Accidents were common. Fatigue was constant. Many factories employed people who had never before worked industrial jobs, and the pace was brutal. But patriotism kept them going. Every explosion on a distant battlefield reminded them why their work mattered. For women, the war brought newfound independence. They managed finances, operated machinery, and supervised teams. For some, it was liberating. For others, exhausting. But when the paychecks came, and the sense of purpose grew, they realized their work was reshaping not only the war, but the future of women in America. For African Americans, the war effort brought both opportunity and frustration. President Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802, banning discrimination in defense industries, opened doors that had long been shut. Black men and women worked in aircraft plants, shipyards, and steel mills. The Double V campaign, victory abroad against fascism and victory at home against racism, captured their determination. They built the weapons of freedom while demanding its promise for themselves. On the shop floors and in the offices, the country's social order was shifting. People who had never worked side by side were now united by a single purpose. The war had blurred class lines, gender roles, and racial boundaries. If only temporarily, even Hollywood joined the effort. Films, newsreels, and radio programs told stories of bravery and sacrifice. Posters reminded workers not to gossip about production secrets. Cartoons taught citizens about saving fuel and buying war bonds. Every medium, every message aimed to keep morale high and focus sharp. By 1943, that focus was paying off. The US war economy had become unstoppable. Aircraft output reached numbers no other nation could dream of. Tank production soared. Ammunition flowed in an endless stream. The military joked that American soldiers never had to worry about running out of bullets. Their biggest problem was carrying them all. The Allies began to turn the tide. In North Africa, American-made tanks rolled across the desert. In Italy, bombers built in Kansas and California darkened the skies. Across the Atlantic, convoys of Liberty ships brought supplies that fed, fueled, and armed entire armies. Every battle, every victory had a piece of America in it. Stamped steel from Pittsburgh, engines from Detroit, aluminum from Oregon, bullets from Illinois. But even as the war's tide shifted, the demands on American industry only grew. The next challenge loomed large: the liberation of Europe, the planned invasion of France. What would become D-Day required the largest military build-up in history. Millions of tons of supplies, vehicles, and ammunition had to be ready, and America answered. Factories increased output yet again. The War Department calculated that the invasion would require 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and hundreds of thousands of vehicles. Within months, those numbers were met. New innovations like prefabricated bridges, amphibious vehicles, and landing craft were designed and built in record time. Nothing seemed impossible anymore. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the US Navy expanded at an extraordinary pace. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines poured out of American shipyards. The once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy, which had dominated early in the war, found itself overwhelmed by sheer numbers. For every ship Japan built, America built 10. By 1944, the United States Navy was the largest the world had ever seen. Its decks swarmed with planes. Its engines roared across oceans. It was the living embodiment of industrial might turned into military power. But power alone wasn't what made America different. It was adaptability, the ability to learn, to improve, to fix what was broken and make it better. Engineers redesigned tanks based on battlefield reports. Factories modified aircraft mid-production to add range or speed. Soldiers' feedback traveled all the way back to the assembly lines, and the designs evolved accordingly. This constant feedback loop between worker, engineer, and soldier became another secret weapon. The Axis powers often clung to rigid systems. America thrived on flexibility. If something didn't work, it was redesigned by the next morning. That willingness to change, to experiment, to keep pushing, gave the Allies a relentless edge. As the tide of war shifted, something else became clear. The industrial transformation was no longer just about winning the war. It was shaping the future world order. America's factories, its scientists, and its workers had built not only weapons, but a foundation for global power. In every sense, the nation was rising, economically, technologically, and morally. It was proving that a democracy could outproduce and outfight dictatorships. It was proving that freedom, when mobilized, was the greatest engine of all. By the end of 1943, the arsenal of democracy was running at full force. Across the Atlantic, the Allies prepared for liberation. Across the Pacific, they prepared for revenge. And behind every mission, every ship, and every plane stood the endless hum of America's industrial heart, pounding, building, creating the tools that would decide the fate of the modern world. But the story wasn't over. The storm of steel and smoke that powered victory was still gathering strength. Ahead lay the greatest invasion in history, the fiercest battles of the Pacific, and the dawn of a weapon so powerful it would end the war, and forever change what humanity was capable of. By early 1944, the United States stood at the height of its industrial power. The transformation that had begun in desperation had become something unstoppable, a living force of metal, energy, and human will. The skies above America never seemed quiet anymore. Across the country, airplanes filled the air, test flights, training flights, delivery flights, thousands of them every day. Railroads thundered under the weight of tanks and ammunition. Shipyards glowed through the night, their cranes swinging, their torches hissing. Everywhere you looked, America was building, and the world could feel it. Factories that had once built cars were now turning out half-tracks and armored vehicles by the thousands. Steel plants worked without pause, feeding an unending hunger for armor and weapons. Copper, aluminum, and oil were shipped in endless convoys to the plants that converted raw materials into power. It was more than production. It was momentum. And that momentum was now carrying the Allies toward a moment the entire world had been waiting for: the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. For nearly 2 years, the United States and its allies had prepared. Operation Overlord, the plan to land in France, would be the most complex military operation in history. Every rifle, every radio, every jeep, every can of gasoline would have to be ready and waiting, and every one of them would come from the factories of the arsenal of democracy. The American home front went into overdrive. Men and women who had already given everything found a way to give more. They worked longer hours, took fewer days off, and volunteered for every shift that kept the production lines moving. War bonds filled movie theaters and public squares. Children collected scrap metal. Farmers increased harvests. No one was untouched by the war, and no one wanted to be. In early 1944, the assembly lines in Detroit and California reached record output. The United States built almost 100,000 aircraft in that single year. Every one of them had a name, a serial number, and a purpose. Some would never return home. But for every plane lost, 2 more replaced it. By spring, the great machine of war was synchronized across an entire continent. From the oil fields of Texas to the factories of Michigan and the ports of New York, everything moved in rhythm. A shell forged in Pittsburgh might end up in a gun on Omaha Beach. A truck built in St. Louis might carry troops through the hedgerows of Normandy. The lines that connected home and battle stretched across oceans, invisible but unbreakable. On June 6, 1944, the invasion began. As the first waves of soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, behind them came the weight of American industry. Landing craft churned through the surf, each one born in a shipyard thousands of miles away. Overhead, thousands of American aircraft darkened the sky, flying missions made possible by the tireless work of mechanics, assemblers, and engineers. In every explosion, in every engine roar, the hand of the factory worker was present. The landings succeeded, but they came at a terrible cost. As news of the invasion spread back home, production didn't slow. It increased. Every mother who lost a son, every wife who received a telegram, every friend who mourned a fallen comrade found strength in the same thought: the work must go on. For every life taken, another weapon must be built. For every battle won, another must be supplied. By the time Allied troops broke through Normandy's defences, America's industrial miracle was feeding an entire continent. Rail lines crisscrossed liberated France, carrying supplies straight from the ports to the front. Convoys stretched for miles, their trucks marked with white stars, each one a product of the Detroit assembly lines. Generals often joked that the most reliable weapon in the US Army wasn't a rifle. It was the Jeep, small, fast, and nearly indestructible. It became the universal symbol of American ingenuity. But the arsenal of democracy was not limited to Europe. Across the vast Pacific, another war raged. One fought not just by armies, but by industries separated by oceans. After the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States had vowed to strike back. And now that promise was being fulfilled. American shipyards launched fleets of aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines that pushed deeper into Japanese-held waters. In 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea would showcase the full might of American production. Over 900 carrier aircraft faced the Japanese in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The outcome was decisive. Japanese losses were catastrophic, and the balance of naval power shifted permanently. Those victories were not just military, they were industrial. Each aircraft lost by Japan was irreplaceable. Each one lost by America could be rebuilt within days. For every Japanese ship sunk, America launched 2 more. The math of war had changed, and the side with the greater factory power was winning. Back home, victory still felt distant, but the confidence was growing. For the first time, people began to believe the end was in sight. The government encouraged workers to keep pushing. Finish the job, the posters said. Fatigue was everywhere, but so was pride. Workers in the aircraft plants would hang photos of soldiers near their stations, reminders of who they were building for. Mothers riveted wings together while listening to radio updates about the front. Every piece of metal, every drop of sweat seemed to carry a story. In 1944 alone, America produced 86,000 aircraft, 17 million rifles and small arms, 57,000 landing craft, 6,000 ships, and over 2 million military trucks. It was not just production, it was domination, and it was now unstoppable. As Allied armies raced across France, the supply lines never faltered. When Patton's tanks ran short of fuel, it wasn't because the oil didn't exist. It was because the trucks simply couldn't drive fast enough to deliver it all. That was the scale of the miracle. Too much supply for the roads to handle. By late 1944, Germany was collapsing under the pressure. Factories bombed, oil fields lost, and production crippled. The once mighty war machine of the Third Reich was starving. Meanwhile, America was producing at levels the world had never seen. And then came one of the war's last great surprises, the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, Hitler launched a desperate counterattack in the forests of Belgium. The weather was bitterly cold, the skies were clouded, and supplies were running thin. But even in those dire conditions, America's industrial power showed its strength. Within weeks, the skies cleared, and waves of US aircraft, built in the factories of Kansas, California, and Washington, rained destruction on German positions. Fresh tanks, fresh trucks, fresh ammunition poured into the front faster than Germany could even comprehend. The offensive collapsed. By spring of 1945, the war in Europe was nearly over. American factories had built the engines of victory, and those engines were now rolling through Germany itself. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, the celebrations erupted, but the factories didn't stop. Across the Pacific, Japan still fought on, and the full weight of America's industrial might now turned eastward. The Pacific War had always been one of distance. Island to island, mile to mile. Each landing required ships, planes, fuel, and supplies that seemed impossible to move across such vast oceans. But American production made the impossible routine. The Navy now had more aircraft carriers than any other nation had ships. Its air wings filled the skies over the Pacific. On the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the full power of American firepower was unleashed. Thousands of tons of bombs, artillery shells, and bullets were expended in weeks. Behind that storm of steel were the nameless workers who had made it all. And yet, even as victory approached, something new and terrifying was being prepared in secret. The Manhattan Project, born from science and necessity, was ready to reveal its outcome. On July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, the first atomic bomb was detonated. The explosion lit the sky brighter than the sun, and the world changed forever. For the scientists who witnessed it, the moment was both awe-inspiring and horrifying. They had created the ultimate weapon, the final expression of human industry and intellect, and now, that weapon would be used to end the war. In August 1945, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The destruction was beyond comprehension. Cities vanished in seconds, and Japan's resistance finally broke. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, Japan formally surrendered. The war was over. The guns fell silent. The world exhaled. After nearly 4 years of total war, America's factories finally began to slow. The assembly lines that had worked without rest now fell quiet. But they had done their job, and more. They had built the machines that saved the free world. They had turned a nation still recovering from depression into a global superpower. And they had proven that democracy, fueled by unity and purpose, could achieve what no empire ever could. In total, the United States produced more than half of all military equipment used by the Allies during the war. Its factories built nearly 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and 5,600 merchant ships. Its workers, men and women alike, had achieved what once seemed impossible. The war had been won not just by soldiers and generals, but by welders, machinists, riveters, and dreamers. Their hands forged victory. Their effort reshaped the world. As peace returned, many wondered what would happen next. Could such massive production be turned back to civilian life? Would the factories close, or would they build something new? The war had ended. After years of thunder and fire, silence finally returned. Across the United States, factory whistles that once signaled the start of another endless shift now marked something else: peace. But peace brought its own uncertainty. Tens of millions of soldiers were coming home. Factories that had built tanks, bombers, and ships now faced empty order books. The question was everywhere. What happens next? No one knew if the economy could survive without war. Memories of the Great Depression still haunted the nation. People feared that when government contracts ended, jobs would vanish, wages would collapse, and the hard-won prosperity of wartime would fade away. Yet, as the weeks turned to months, something remarkable happened. Instead of falling back into despair, America transformed once again, this time from a wartime engine into a peacetime powerhouse. The Great Conversion. In 1945 and 1946, the massive wartime industries began to change. The same assembly lines that had produced fighter planes now turned out automobiles. The same shipyards that had launched destroyers now built cargo freighters and ocean liners, and the factories that had once filled bomb bays now filled supermarket shelves. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, once the backbone of tank and truck production, returned to making cars for families who had waited nearly 5 years to buy one. Steel mills that had rolled armor plate now poured the foundations for bridges, skyscrapers, and highways. Aluminum, once scarce and reserved for aircraft, now became the metal of modern living, for toasters, refrigerators, and the sleek shapes of a new American dream. The transition was not easy. In the first months after the war, strikes broke out as workers demanded higher wages. Factories had to retool. Supplies had to shift from government rationing back to civilian markets. But the skills, discipline, and efficiency learned during wartime production gave American industry an edge the world had never seen before. Within 2 years, unemployment fell to record lows. By 1947, industrial output was higher than it had been at the peak of the war. The United States, once unsure it could survive peacetime, now led the global economy. The soldiers come home. At the same time, millions of veterans returned. The government passed the GI Bill, one of the most important pieces of legislation in American history. It offered education, low-cost housing loans, and job training to the men and women who had served. Colleges that had once trained engineers for war now filled with students studying to build the future. Suburbs began to rise on the edges of cities. Neat rows of homes built with materials once used for barracks and hangars. Families that had once huddled around radios during blackouts now gathered in living rooms lit by optimism. A new middle class was forming, powered by industry and innovation. Factories hired veterans as managers, machinists, and designers. Their experience from the front lines, their discipline and teamwork, blended with America's industrial momentum to create something entirely new. It was not just a recovery, it was a rebirth, a world in ruins, and a new superpower. Beyond America's shores, the picture was far different. Europe lay in ruins. Cities like Berlin, Warsaw, and London bore the scars of years of bombing. In Asia, Japan was devastated, its infrastructure shattered, its cities burned. The Soviet Union had suffered unimaginable losses. In that world of destruction, the United States stood almost untouched. Its factories were intact. Its cities had never been bombed. Its farms were producing record harvests, and its industrial machine, the same one that had armed the Allies, was now the only one capable of rebuilding the world. From this moment, America became more than a nation. It became the supplier of recovery. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, poured billions of dollars into Europe. American steel, machinery, and vehicles rebuilt roads, bridges, and factories. Ships carried food to feed starving populations. American tractors plowed European fields once again. In Japan, General Douglas MacArthur oversaw reconstruction. Factories that had produced weapons were converted to electronics and automobiles, industries that would one day rise again to global prominence. But in those first years, it was American machines, American capital, and American engineers who helped rebuild. For the first time in history, one nation possessed the industrial capacity to reshape the world, and the world would never be the same. The Cold War begins. Yet peace did not bring universal harmony. By the late 1940s, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union began to grow. The same factories that had produced weapons for World War II now turned to new kinds of defense. Jet engines replaced propellers, rockets replaced artillery, and deep beneath laboratories and deserts, scientists continued the research that had begun with the Manhattan Project. The atomic age had dawned, and America's industry led the way. Companies like General Electric, Boeing, and Lockheed transformed wartime innovation into the foundation of a new era of technology, radar, jet propulsion, and computing, all born from war, now shaped the future. In a sense, the Industrial Revolution of World War II never really ended. It simply evolved. From mass-produced tanks to mass-produced televisions, from radar screens to computer screens, from assembly lines of war to assembly lines of peace. The birth of the modern economy, the lessons of wartime production, efficiency, scale, innovation became the blueprint for post-war prosperity. Corporations expanded, highways linked cities, air travel became commercial, and consumer goods flooded the market at a rate no other country could match. Refrigerators, washing machines, and radios became symbols of comfort. Television transformed culture and communication. The same drive that once filled bombers with engines now filled homes with modern convenience. By the 1950s, the American worker who had once riveted aircraft wings was now earning enough to buy a home, a car, and to send their children to college. The prosperity seemed endless, and its roots traced directly back to the war. World War II had forced America to do the impossible, to build faster, think bigger, and work together. Those habits became the foundation of a new way of life, the human legacy. For the millions who had lived through it, the war was more than a memory. It was a measure of what people could achieve when united. Women, who had entered factories in unprecedented numbers, had proven beyond doubt their strength and skill. Though many were pushed out of industrial jobs after the war, the experience forever changed their place in society. It planted the seeds for the women's rights movements that would follow. African American workers, too, had played a crucial role. The struggle for fair employment during the war, from the Double V campaign to the first major civil rights protests, marked the beginning of a new chapter in the fight for equality. The factories of the arsenal of democracy had become, in many ways, the testing ground for a more inclusive America. A legacy of innovation, the technological breakthroughs of wartime continued to shape decades of progress. Aircraft design led to the space race. Wartime medicine gave rise to antibiotics and new surgical techniques. And the collaboration between government, science, and private industry created a model that would drive innovation for generations. The computer revolution of the 1960s, the moon landing of 1969, and the internet era that followed, all could trace their origins back to the industrial mobilization of the 1940s. It was during those years that America learned how to turn imagination into reality, not through individual genius alone, but through the coordinated effort of millions. The world America built. In the decades after the war, America's factories continued to power global change. Automobiles, airplanes, electronics, and entertainment flowed outward, carrying not just products, but ideas. The post-war world, democratic, consumer-driven, and technologically advanced, was, in large part, the creation of that wartime generation, but with success came responsibility. As the Cold War deepened, America's industrial strength became both shield and sword, the foundation of deterrence, the guarantee of freedom, and, at times, the cause of tension. From Korea to Vietnam, the factories once again produced weapons, though never on the same all-consuming scale as before. Still, the memory of the 1940s remained, proof that when the nation united, it could achieve the extraordinary. The final reflection. By the time the veterans of World War II grew old, the world they had built was almost unrecognizable. Airplanes that once struggled across oceans now crossed them in hours. Computers filled offices and homes. Satellites orbited the Earth. All of it, every leap, every breakthrough, stood on the foundation laid during those dark, determined years. The arsenal of democracy had not just built weapons, it had built a future. In the end, the American Industrial Revolution of World War II was more than a story of factories and machines. It was a story of people, ordinary citizens who answered an extraordinary call. It was the story of a nation that, when pushed to the brink, found its greatest strength not in its weapons, but in its unity. And though the smoke of war has long faded, its legacy endures. In every innovation, in every skyscraper, in every dream built from hard work and hope. Because once, in the face of the greatest challenge in human history, America proved that democracy could build and rebuild the world.